to start with the most current situation in the Middle East, what's going on right now in Sheikh Jarrah. It's all over the news. The possible eviction of the Palestinian families who've been living there for quite some time. Tell us the background to that story and what you think the proper, just solution would be for all sides involved in this conflict.
Hi, Ellie. Very nice to be with you and nice to be with all of you. It's much easier to travel to Toronto on Zoom. Um, I'm having a ball traveling all across North America. The Sheikh Jarrah. I just wanted to say something. I wanted to smile before I started to talk about Sheikh Jarrah, if that's okay, Ellie. Sheikh Jarrah, what's happening? Nothing. Because the courts suspended, they were about to give a ruling, and what happens is the courts in Israel don't have a choice as to which cases they take and which cases they don't take. The Supreme Court. They have to give a ruling on every case that presents itself before them. And as a result, when the political consequences might be so horrific, they could just simply say, you know, we're going to suspend it, and we'll suspend it and then tell the people to set up a committee. So for now, it's indefinitely suspended. Now, the story itself of Sheikh Jarrah, you started to ask me what's happening, and then you asked me what's the story and what should be a just solution. There's the whole discussion around Israel could be encapsulated with Sheikh Jarrah, because each side, on the one hand, has a story. Each one has a legal case. Each one has their facts. The facts on the side of Israeli Jews is that, in fact, these properties were owned by Jews. Somewhere at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, Jews principally from Taiman who immigrated. There was no room in the old city, where, by the way, my grandfather at the time lived. There was no room for people to move into the old city, and so they bought properties around the old city, and there weren't large numbers. And one group of houses was bought in Sheikh Jarrah. Their ownership is registered. It's clear. It's uncontested. When the Jordanians took over that section of Jerusalem in the 1948 war, they abrogated the Jewish ownership, and they gave it to Palestinians. So the Jewish side says, listen, we came home. It's our opportunity to give justice back to those who suffered injustice. That's the Jewish side. The Palestinian side says these people, in fact, were invited by the Jordanians, paid to buy this property. They weren't involved in the larger geopolitical arguments. They paid for their houses, and they've been living there. Some of them third generation now living there. So who's the rightful owner right now? Now it gets a little more complicated, because Israel says, well, the courts are challenged because, in fact, the Jordanians never registered these new owners. They never formally registered their purchase. So the only formal purchase that's on record is the Jews going back to the end of the 19th century. The reverse side is that in 1948, Israel said that any property which was prior owned by Palestinians who left, and they could have either left to leave Israel or they left to go to other neighborhoods in Israel, they lost their claim on their homes. So, for example, I live in a home. You know, it's a very desirable thing in Jerusalem to live in what is called an Arab house. These are houses with high ceilings. My walls are about a meter thick, very, very beautiful, well-built homes. But an Arab home is not a home that was built by Arabs. These are homes that were owned by Arabs. But come 1948, there was a do-over. Each side laid claim to their space. And since 1948, life continued. The only problem for the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah is that their story doesn't end in 1948. In 1967, everything got reversed for them. It didn't get reversed for me. It didn't get reversed for the Palestinians in Lod. It didn't get reversed for the Palestinians in Haifa. But for us, it got reversed. Excuse me, for Sheikh Jarrah Palestinians, it got reversed. So now they're in this situation where, for a Jew, no Palestinian could come to a Jewish owner and say, give me back my house. But since we reversed the order of things in Sheikh Jarrah, we now could claim and undermine their property claim. Now, those are the facts. You asked what needs to happen. We have to realize that the issue of Sheikh Jarrah, when we think that the issue of Sheikh Jarrah is a legal issue, we fail to internalize the rabbinic teaching which says that Jerusalem was destroyed because the Jewish people followed the law and were not willing to commit themselves to the moral principles of going beyond the requirement of the law. From a purely legal perspective, the property has to be handed back to the Jewish owners. From a purely legal perspective, the courts, which have to decide on the basis of law, who has a legal deed, there is no competition. Case is simple. Belongs to the Jews. And there's nobody who ever reversed their claim or had a right to do so, and they were never compensated for it. But when you think it's a legal issue, that's when you're blind. And that's when there is a sense of a lack of understanding of what the issue is at hand. We're not here legal scholars debating things in a court of law. We are trying to figure out in a court of public opinion whether you're being a mensch, whether it passes the smell test of decency. Israel cannot declare that 1948 created a do-over to all prior ownerships and only apply that to Jews. Just can't do that. And when it does, it's basically saying might makes right. And when you say might makes right, don't be surprised that people question your moral principles. That's the story of Sheikh Jarrah. And it is that type of story that repeats itself over and over again in the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians. And those who want to defend Israel, we're armed with our facts and we have our story. And the Palestinians have their stories. But the serious question we have to ask ourselves are not what the facts are, but what does moral decency require of us? And Sheikh Jarrah, it is actually a very, very simple case. We cannot uproot Palestinians from their homes if we are enabling Jews to be immune from prior legal deeds on properties owned by Palestinians. And if we do so, we are discriminating. And if we do so, we shouldn't be surprised that people aren't that impressed by our moral standing.
So it reminds me of a phrase we used right before our conversation began of Derech Eretz Kadmol Torah. Perhaps you can for our audience.
Derech Eretz, there's a very famous rabbinic saying, Derech Eretz Kadmala Torah. Being a mensch comes before your legal principles. And we belong to a tradition which says that when you don't understand that, you lose your sovereignty. This is why we lost, the temple was destroyed and we lost our sovereignty, because we thought that what we're supposed to do is follow we're legally correct. Legal, that's the minimal level of decency. The much higher level of decency is derech eretz, menschlichkeitness. This is the standard. And Sheikh Jarrah is just a very, when you know what the issue is, it becomes simple. And when you don't know what the issue is, and you think it's a legal debate, you're actually doing tremendous harm to Israel and the Jewish people.
Very interesting perspective. Let's now turn back to the recent war in Gaza. About a dozen Israeli civilians lost their lives and about 200 or more Palestinian casualties occurred, including over 50 children. Those who defend Israel argue that the state's first right is to protect, or its obligation, I should say, is to protect its own citizens from terrorists firing rockets on innocent civilians. Those who criticize Israel argue that the loss of children's lives can never, ever be justified, even if the goal was to eliminate terrorists firing rockets at Israel. What is your view on that?
I think the second argument is completely both intellectually and morally false. In war, people are going to die. And under the United Nations, under the Geneva Accord, everybody understands this, that the presence of civilian population cannot undermine your ability to fight a war that is just. Because then it would be great. I attack you, I hide behind civilians, and it's never really never justified? You now have immunity because you're fighting from the midst of civilians? There is not a single serious intellectual voice, either in political philosophy and moral philosophy, who would make that argument. It's a populist argument. But it's just simply not true. The serious question, there's two separate discussions in legal and political thought. One pertains to whether a war is just or not, and the second is how you're fighting that war, whether you're fighting a just war justly. And a country has to obligate itself to fulfill both principles. The only recognized war, which as a just war, is a war of self-defense, a war to protect your country and to protect your civilians. That internationally, United Nations, everybody, every moral philosopher worth their salt, unless you are a pacifist, which is a coherent moral philosophy, but that doesn't speak about the death of children. It just believes that the use of force under any conditions is unacceptable. I'm not a pacifist, and none of you are, and no nation state in the world exists by being a pacifist. No country in the world could be a pacifist. You have your interests, and I have a right to protect myself when it's being attacked. So the fact that they are fighting and embedding themselves in the midst of a civilian population cannot allow or render my ability to defend myself unjust. Just can't. That's not Daniel Hartman. That's not Zionism. That's the Geneva Accords. It's the Geneva Accord. Now, there is a serious question, though, on how do you fight a just war justly? And there, the question is whether you're doing everything in your power to avoid civilian casualties. Now, Israel, in fact, I believe, has done everything in its power to avoid civilian casualties. It has. But still, why is it that nobody is impressed with that? So, Eli, your question is really serious, because why is it, if despite the fact that it was a just war, because listen, you're firing over 4,000 missiles at me. Of course I have a right to defend myself. And of course I have a right to defend myself, including, and at the end of the day, 200 civilian casualties, even though every life counts, is not a horrific, is not a crazy number. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands often die under similar circumstances. And Israel has this process of knocking on of knocking on roofs with non-explosive bombs so that the population will evacuate the building. All of the above, great. We can now pat ourselves on the back and feel great. So why is nobody buying this? Why was there such serious condemnation against Israel? So thank God we always have the anti-Semitism card. We could always take every moral criticism and say, well, what do you want? They're anti-Semites. Baruch Hashem, if it wasn't for anti-Semitism, I don't know what we would do. So thank God. I hope people don't know me, but I have a little morbid sense of humor. So I hope I'm not upsetting anybody. I think I'm funny. My mother thinks I'm funny. My wife's not sure. So whether you think I'm funny or not is a separate question. But anti-Semitism, what can we do? They're anti-Semites. They hate us, whatever. Fine. Okay. So now we got rid of some of the critics. But there are others. There are serious people who aren't anti-Semites. And there are serious people who aren't morally obtuse who claim that, oh, 1 second, you can't go to war if there's going to be any civilian casualties. What is it that Israel is still doing wrong? And here, Eli, I think the bigger question is not whether Israel conducted itself morally during the war, but whether people still are convinced that Israel cares about Palestinian lives. And here the critical issue is not what Israel did during the war, but 54 years since 67. Nobody's listening anymore. Oh, the friends of Israel are listening. But more and more people are asking whether Israelis see power as a first resort. And whether for every, when I have a hammer, every problem is a nail. People are wondering whether Israel, given our immense power, we just don't worry anymore. You'll attack us, we know how to defend ourselves. I don't believe that Israel has been working sufficiently, either in its policy and as a result also in world opinion, to convince and bear witness to the fact that it really wants to resolve its conflicts with the Palestinians peacefully. Now, I don't think Hamas wants peace, but it's at least a decade now that Israel hasn't innovated and pushed for any peace process. The condemnation in Gaza is morally problematic not because of what Israel did, but because of people's sense of what Israel did not do in the days, weeks, months, and years which preceded it. And so it's that larger context of, I would say, when does the story start? So when it comes to Israel's perspective, the story of the war begins when Hamas fires a missile. The middle of the story is when Israel exercises its moral responsibility to self-defense and responds. And the story ends when Israel decides it's achieved its goals. Great. Here it is. We have a just war fought justly, brought to an end. And from an Israeli perspective, and this is the story that most Israelis tell, Gaza was a non-event. But part of what's happening today is that most people, or more people in the world, are no longer buying that the war started when Hamas fires its missiles. For them, the war starts with an ongoing occupation and use of force on the part of Israel to control Palestinians. And Israel using its force to avoid pushing for peace. And Israel using its force to ensure that the current status quo doesn't change. And as a result, with settlement buildings, settlement expansions, etc. When the war starts then, it's no longer self-evident that it's a just war. Eli, does that make sense to you?
Yes, it does. So, but objectively, where do we start? The war started with the firing of rockets, or does the war start before that? How do you objectively view that?
You can't. There is no objective. I think part of it is they're both right. They're both right. Hamas would have fired its missiles anyway. Hamas is not firing as a result of Israel's occupation of Judea and Samaria. Hamas is firing its missiles because they want Jews dead, literally. They want not just Israelis, they want Jews dead. And when Jews die, it's a good day for Hamas. The fact that they were able to manipulate our stupidity to give themselves a get-out-of-jail card for their aggression is another issue. But I think so, on the one hand, in the micro war with Hamas, it was a simple war and one which I feel personally, morally very, very comfortable with. But in the larger context, I believe that's also correct. I believe, I'm sorry, yes.
No innocent children lost their lives. And people are saying, isn't there anything Israel could have done to avoid the loss of innocent life of children?
Nothing.
And they did to the best of their ability.
Like I know, for example, like nobody's interested, but I know this for a fact. But this is part of the facts, like you talk to yourself, and it's very moving to yourself, but it's irrelevant. But I know that over 20 kids were killed in a building where Israel wasn't even targeting the building. Israel was trying to destroy Hamas tunnels, because half of Gaza are tunnels. And their engineers, and each time they bombed a tunnel, engineers gave an assessment of as what will the collateral damage be. And in this case, the engineers said the tunnel's far away from the building, nothing will happen. And they were wrong. See, Eli, I want to tell you, I was a tank commander and I went to war. And in the war that I fought, 25% of the casualties were self-inflicted. If any of you went to war, you know that the level of chaos is beyond comprehension. Beyond comprehension. I remember at one point in the war in Lebanon, we were, the larger commander got on the radio and said to all of us, 2,000 meters to the north, enemy forces, open fire, immediately end. And gave all of us gear. Enemy forces are traveling. I go down, and this is an older tank at the time. I was fighting on an M48, which was a phenomenal tank in the Korean War. And I go down and I measure the distance, and I tell my gunner, and I tell my loader which shell to put in. I lock the target, I measure the distance, and I give the final order of fire to my gunner. And in those old tanks, once I give the final order, the gunner has to do a small little move to ensure the stability of the gun. It takes about a second and a half. Between my giving him an order to fire and him pressing on the trigger, there's a screaming on the radio, ceasefire, ceasefire. It was our tanks. These were the first Merkava tanks that Israel was using in battle. And from 2,000 kilometers, they looked like T-72s. Nobody recognized them. We almost wiped each other out. Wiped each other out. There is just, when you're and that's when you're dealing with your own forces. There is chaos. When Gaza, which is the most population dense area in the world, and from in the midst of that, they're firing missiles, and you're trying to destroy their command and control centers, to think that you're going to do so without civilian casualties, it's just never going to happen. And morally, we cannot be limited from defending ourselves because they're firing out of Gaza. There is no way. Could there be of a little less? Could be. Could be. So if there was 20, it was, oops, and it happens. It just, you know that whenever you're firing, it happens. But I want to tell you, in this war in Gaza was fought very differently from the prior two wars in Gaza. The first war in Gaza was fought with the aim to destroy Hamas. The second war in Gaza was fought to degrade, not to defeat them, to degrade their military capacity. Both defeating Hamas and degrading their military capacity requires putting in ground forces. The minute you put in ground forces, casualties are in the thousands. In the thousands. Because now you're going after anyone with a gun, every missile launcher, no matter where it is. And in fact, the prior wars in Gaza had thousands of casualties. Thousands. This war was not to defeat Hamas. It was not to degrade Hamas, their military capacity. It was to deter them from attacking us for as much as possible. And to do so, we were trying to destroy what Hamas cares about. Because Hamas doesn't care about their citizens, and they don't care about their soldiers. They care about their command and control centers. And that's what they have to rebuild. And if the price would be high enough, they wouldn't attack us next month. They'll wait. Maybe it will give us 2 years, maybe 3 years. This was a war which was fought with the highest level of precision, with an attempt to have the least civilian casualties. There still were civilian casualties, but it's just, you're never going to fight with less than that. It'll never happen. I've seen it, I'm telling you. When you have to fire what you see, what you don't see, when you're firing from miles away, it's just, it's the way it is, Eli. That's why, David HaMelech in Divrei Yamim, in the Chronicles, in the end of the Bible, David HaMelech says to Solomon, my whole life, my dream was to build a temple to God. But God came to me and said, David, you cannot build a temple. Your hands are stained with crime. Your son, he will build for me a temple. There's no way to maintain your moral purity when you go to war. It's just not possible. Now, I killed people. Do I know that every single person? I don't know. And God says, even if you're doing the right thing, there's going to be a price you pay. There is that price. And part of our responsibility, Eli, is to recognize that. And that's why war and power, this use has to be a last resort. It has to come after years and years of perpetually trying to avoid it. The important question is not at that moment, but the context of the war. At that moment, Israel, I think, was fine. The context of the war was not.
Well, the expression "war is hell." You certainly articulated it very well in that answer.
Oh.
And I think speaking as a person who tries to bend to the center, I agree with you. I will still say that the loss of life is tragic, especially children's lives. We need to mourn that, even as you say that.
Correct. I agree with you, Eli. I wasn't speaking about mourning. I wasn't speaking about it being tragic. I wasn't being callous about it. All of that, you're absolutely correct. But it's another thing to recognize that every time you go to war, there are inevitable consequences. And that's why it's critical that you do everything you can to avoid going to war.
So let me go back to the core of the beginning of the history, where there's two specific sides, and how do we respond to this? 1948, Israel's War of Independence, which the Arab world or the Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, where 700,000 Palestinians were created in the wake of the war. Israelis blame Palestinians, and especially the neighboring countries, for launching a war that created this whole problem in the first place. And the Arabs and Palestinians blame Israelis for their role in the exodus of Palestinians from Israel, not allowing them to return. Who bears responsibility? How do we have something that we call Israel's War of Independence and we celebrate it with Yom HaAtzmaut? They call Nakba as the world's greatest tragedy. And where is the truth between those two? How much responsibility does each side bear for what happened to the Palestinians in 48 and subsequently?
You see, at some point, there is no issue. The truth doesn't matter anymore. See, the reality is, let's take, for example, I believe that if the Palestinians had accepted the UN partition plan, there would have been no Nakba. Israel accepted it, the Palestinians didn't. So, and if they would have accepted it, there would have been no 700,000 Palestinian refugees. There would have been no war. This UN partition plan made a very clear designation: what would belong to Israel, what would be an Arab state. Would have been simple. So let's say I accept that. But the reality is, Eli, there still was a Nakba. I could recognize that even if I don't bear sole responsibility, that my coming home was a catastrophe for somebody. Now that obligates me. Now, I have to understand that, I sing Hatikva. I say I had a 2,000-year hope to come home. And I came home. But I came home to a country where there were other people whose life was just fine before I showed up. So the fact that they didn't welcome me, okay. The fact that they didn't accept the UN partition plan, okay, shame on you. But the reality is now, I'm not trying to resolve 1947 and 1948. Nobody can. And if you try to, you're going to go round and around and around. And all you will have is, I have these are my grandchildren. I have 4 now. My oldest grandson is 3. I have until 1936, till 2036, before my grandson has to go into the army. So what is it going to be? Are we going to keep on? What's going to be in 36? Are we still going to debate it? Does my grandchild have a chance at a life that was better than mine? I came within half a second of dying. Literally. 2 Syrian shells blew my tank apart. I was half a second from dying. My brother-in-law was killed in the same war. So what's going to happen? So my little grandchild, Ellery, what do we have? So I'm going to debate 47, who was at fault? At what point am I going to say, you want to do that? Okay, you do it and I'll do it and we'll just knock yourselves out and you'll feel really righteous. But 2036, at what point do we say it just doesn't matter anymore? You have your facts and I have my facts. Okay, so what? I know that I've caused you pain and you know that I'm here. So now what do you want to do? You want to keep on fighting? Or do you want to build a future for our kids and our grandchildren? It's your choice, and it's my choice. That's the only question. Because at the end of the day, there'll never be a resolution. There never will be. And I could quote to you the whole story from 47 to 67 to 73 to 81 to 2000 to 95, 97, 2000. I have all the facts which will tell me that we did nothing wrong, and the Palestinians rejected peace. And the Palestinians will quote their stories, starting with 1917, when the colonial British ignored that they were there, and the Jewish settlers in 29 and 33 Peel Report, and 47 and 6. They'll tell you their story. And then what you have is 2 sides trying to convince the world that they're the true victim, instead of each side trying to minimize the victimization of their people in the future. So let's know that you can't resolve that one. And let's pick a future which might be better.
Basically, what you're saying is both sides have just arguments, but if we spend the rest of our lives debating that, we'll never get anywhere.
I might not even think that both sides have just arguments. Both sides think that they have just arguments. That's what's critical. It's just doesn't matter anymore. Just doesn't matter. Like for me, what do I? 2036, Ellie, that's all I got. That's all I got. And I want to tell you the hardest thing that ever happened to me in my life, it was not going to war, and it was not almost dying. It was the day my son went into the army. And the second hardest day was the day when he was fighting in Gaza, and when I couldn't protect him. And the third hardest day in my life will be when my grandchild has to go into the war. That's what has to change.
Well, let me ask you another question. You definitely believe in a 2-state solution, but there are people on both sides who claim, there are Arabs who claim that Jews and Israelis are never interested in peace. There are Jews and Israelis who claim that the Arabs are never interested in peace. Do you feel there's enough goodwill on both sides to actually implement a two-state solution on both sides of the conflict?
No.
And yet you still believe in a two-state solution.
My beliefs don't have to be grounded in reality. They're aspirational.
Uh-huh.
We Jews, we also believed that for 2,000 years we were going to come back to Jerusalem. We Jews are a people who never define our aspirations on the basis of reality. To be a Jew is to be committed to ideas and to values and to commit your life to changing reality in accordance with those values. It's really simple. That's our story. Look at, who are we? Ellie, look at the story of your life. All of you, look at the stories of your lives. What does it mean to be a Jew? What do you think? If I was going to accept reality, I would have checked out a long time ago. I would have given up on the Jewish people. We should have been dead tens of times. The Jewish story should be over. So if you want to deal reality, you shouldn't be talking to the Jewish people. I believe in a two-state solution because the two-state solution, I believe, is the only way to achieve, both for the Jewish people and the Palestinian people, their inalienable rights to sovereignty and their inalienable right to peace and dignity. That's what I believe in. Now, our job is to try to make that happen. Right now, we're about, since 2000, on the Palestinian side, since 2002, and on the Jewish side, since 2005, we have done nothing to further the two-state solutions. And when you have between 15 to 18, 19 years of working in the opposite direction, don't be surprised that more and more Israelis and more Palestinians no longer even believe in it, no longer even want it. And so is it irreversible? Not yet. It's not yet irreversible, but we have to work very hard to change these processes. And the problem is that we're not yet trying hard enough.
Do you feel the new political government in Israel has more of a chance of moving in that direction?
No. It doesn't, because the nature of that coalition is that it is a coalition that could only survive. It was built around changing Israel's policies within the Green Lines, leaving for another time the status of Judea and Samaria and Gaza. There is no consensus on this government on what Israel's borders and foreign policies should be. And it is about coming together to heal Israeli society inside, Jew and Arab alike. And so they have no ability to engage in any dramatic moves. The one thing that they might be able to change, which is significant, is that Netanyahu has advocated openly for many years that a position in which Israel's greatest asset is its force and its power. And he would say, nobody wants a relationship with us because they like our values. They have a relationship with us if they respect our power. And as a result, under the Netanyahu governments, Israel has stopped talking a moral discourse. Now, Bennett might, and then Lapid, might change that discourse. There won't be a dramatic change. But you said Derech Eretz Kadma Torah, Ali, beforehand. Derech Eretz Kadma nationalism too. Derech Eretz is who we have to be. And a foreign policy in which Derech Eretz is an integral part of it is something that our neighborhood needs. And Israel hasn't had that or implemented it, and as a result has caused serious challenges for us.
So I do see a little bit of a ray of hope with the new government. Another question for which comes up all the time is, obviously legitimate criticism of Israel is fair game. Often it crosses the line into anti-Semitism. How do you distinguish between fair criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism?
It's a great question. And we don't really know, right? We don't really know. I'll just tell you the rule that I use. Whenever somebody, when Israel, I would put it, when Israel is described as a personification of evil, as the embodiment of evil, that's an anti-Semitic trope, because that's what they did with Jews. Jews were the embodiment of the evil du jour, money-hungry, Christ killers, whatever it might be, self-centered. Whatever was perceived to be evil, we personified it. When Israel is described in terms of as the personification of evil, then I treat you like I do every anti-Semite. I don't try to convince you. I just defend myself against you. But when it's not the personification of evil, I don't try to get into people's motivations, because I don't think it helps us. I think we have to separate the motivations of the critic from the content of the criticism. And even if the motivation of the critic might not be pure, if the content of the criticism needs to be answered, you can't answer it by ad hominem attacks against the personality of the critic. And when you do so, you're not helping Israel, because what you're doing is you're developing or presenting a public facade in which you're whitewashing Israel's crimes instead of responding to it. So when you vilify Israel as the worst embodiment of white power and colonialism, I'm just not interested. Other than that, let's deal with the content. Whether the motivation was anti-Semitic or not doesn't matter. And I would recommend to Jews, we have to stop using the anti-Semitic defense, because it's not working for the young next generation of Jews. When they hear us using it, we tend to use it with too broad a stroke, and it presents us as being frightened and as if we can't defend ourselves because our positions are indefensible. So there's the blatant anti-Semites, defend yourself against them. For all the rest, let's deal with the content. And the question is, how do we make a case for Israel? And we're not going to make a case for Israel by fighting facts like in Sheikh Jarrah. We're going to make a case for Israel by making sure that Israel is engaged in a serious moral pursuit. And when you're engaged in a serious moral pursuit, people will trust your moral character. When you're not, when people trust your moral character, they'll take it as granted that you're working out of moral concerns. When people don't trust your moral character, all the arguments in the world won't be able to make people trust that you're in fact acting out of moral impulse.
You know, you said something which I think, especially if younger students are online, would be of interest to them. A common trope that you hear is, just like the British and the French and the Spanish colonized places all over the world and exploited and sent the resources home, that's exactly what Israel. Israel is a colonized, settler, white state, exploited. How would you concisely respond to that criticism, which is obviously not correct, but how would you respond?
You see, the problem is you have to have a response that someone wants to hear. Because I could give you a whole lecture which will move me deeply, and you and I will have a great time. So, I can't tell you I'm so smart, and our parents will have nachas from everything that we know. Because in fact, colonization is an irrelevant. Colonization is an act where you have a home country, and you are now trying to capture and to include their major section of the world under your hegemony. We weren't colonizing anything. We were coming home.
Right.
So the use of the term is just simply irrelevant. But it doesn't matter. Just doesn't matter. The bottom line is that people... This is the problem, Ellie. We're fighting the wrong fight. I just finished writing an article about this. It's going to come out in our new Hartman Journal on called Sources. When it comes out, I'll send it to you, and you can send it to the people here. We're debating... We're offering the wrong facts. It's not that our facts aren't correct. They're just the wrong facts. Just doesn't matter. People are believing these claims about us because it's not clear that we are pursuing a moral high ground anymore. That's the problem. And when you're not pursuing it, people believe all the accusations because you think the people who use like apartheid or colon, you think they've actually studied the categories. Oh, Israel can't be an apartheid state. We don't have segregated bathrooms and whatever. I give you all we're for 17 different reasons. We're different from South Africa. It's just not what the conversation is. That when they're using the term "we're a colonizer," they're basically saying you're corrupt. What they're basically saying is you believe that might makes right, and to the victor goes all the spoils. They don't trust us anymore. And therefore, and when we argue facts, we're not creating greater trust, we're actually creating greater mistrust. We need to create a liberal narrative of Zionism and Israel, and we need liberal policies in Israel in which the core moral principles that most of us care about have a strong place. But if instead of that we're filled with all of these factual defenses, it's the wrong argument, Ellie. It's just nobody's listening to us.
I hear you. Now, I do agree with you. However, we did get a question from the audience we can't label everything anti-Semitic. However, would you label the BDS movement as anti-Semitic?
The BDS movement is divided between the founders of BDS and those people who advocate for it. The founders of BDS are absolutely anti-Semitic. Their goal is not to get Israel out of the occupied territories. Their goal is to go back to 1947 and to deny the Jewish people a right to sovereignty. And that is a fundamental discriminatory act against Jews. So at its core, BDS was founded on discrimination in which Jews alone do not have a right to statehood, despite what the United Nations and the international community. And if you want to revert Israel back to 1947, you're going to be creating one of the greatest human rights crises in history right now, with the 7.2 million Jews who live there. Not to speak of the 2 million Arabs, 85% of whom don't want to be part of a Palestinian state. They want to remain in Israel. So, and the Arabs in Israel are against BDS because they don't want people boycotting Israeli products. They don't boycott Israeli products. They want to be part of Israel. But do people afterwards who believe that that you should use commerce as a vehicle to express your moral positions, is that by definition anti-Semitic? Absolutely not. I might believe it's mistaken. Principally, I believe it's unhelpful, because whenever BDS happens, it just causes both Israelis and Palestinians to hunker down and to stop looking for solutions. When Israelis experience BDS, they experience the world is against us, and then you circle the wagons and you hunker down and you say nothing's going to happen. When the Palestinians experience BDS, they say, my fantasy that one day Israel will disappear, maybe it'll happen. I don't have to recognize it. So BDS, in fact, instead of solving the conflict, perpetuates it. But is it by definition anti-Semitic? Again, some of it is. But for many people, it's just, was it when you didn't buy Californian grapes, was that anti-Semitic? People make moral choices. So I might think they're wrong. I might think that they're biased. But to say that it's by definition anti-Semitic, again, doesn't help us at all. Because everybody knows that consumers make choices. And when you're making a distinction between Israel and settlements, it could be anti-Semitic, but it's too broad. It's too easy. And when we take that easy road, we lose the next generation of Jews, and we lose the next generations of Canadians and Americans who know fully well that they're not being motivated by anti-Semitism. They want you to talk to them. They want you to talk to them about the righteousness of what Israel's doing. Talk to them. When you talk to them, you have a chance to win. When you label someone anti-Semitic who's not anti-Semitic, don't be surprised that they don't become your friend, because that's not the best way to make friends and influence people.
You know, it's interesting. I one time had a debate with a very good person, a very fine person. I'll create a name for her, Jennifer. And she wasn't anti-Semitic, but she supported BDS. I said to Jennifer, let me say something to you. I believe you want peace. I know you believe I want peace. And when you want to support BDS, you hope to influence Jews and Israelis to be different. But as soon as you advocate BDS, 99.9% of all Jews and Israelis around the world just leave the conversation. So instead of further, they're actually going in the opposite direction. And she said, you know what, let me think about that. So
It's exactly my position, Ellie. And you want to know something really interesting? Look, even the left all of a sudden settlements, which are now part of Israel. Because the minute you boycott settlements, it's my settlement. I didn't want to go there, but what? Ben and Jerry? What? A settler can't? A settler, if they want to have Ben and Jerry's, are going to have to buy it in Tel Aviv and it'll defrost by the time they come home. How care you do such a thing? Such level of injustice. Everybody's on the side of the settlers. So Ellie, what you said is exactly what happens. And it makes, it's like, it's our muscle. You attack us. When you're attacking us, I don't ask who, what, we're all the same. So it is one of the most ineffective movements. It is still very ineffective. We Jews give it tremendous press and make it far more effective than it is. It's very ineffective. Our Palestinians don't want it. So but it's just destructive. But we're fighting the wrong, instead of giving your argument, when we give this righteous one of how dare you, why aren't you boycotting Syria? Like, really? Are we really upset that people have of Israel higher moral expectations than they have of Syria? Like, why don't I boycott Syria and Korea? First of all, there's no product from Syria or Korea that I buy, and I have no trade to Syria and Korea. Okay, China, nobody boycotts China because we don't want to commit suicide. So Israel's not China. We got to sort of get real. You don't pretend you're a gorilla when you're really the size of a grind monkey. So there has to be a little realism in the story. But at the end of the day, why are people boycotting Israel and they're not boycotting Syria or other countries? Because Israel is part of the liberal democratic West, in which a moral conversation is relevant. Moral expectations from Israel are not a sign of anti-Semitism. That's who we are. And thank God they have greater expectations from us than they have from Assad. Wonderful. But it's a mistaken, ineffective policy. But we are making the wrong arguments over and over and over again. And then we wonder why we're not convincing people.
So I want to move, before we come to the end of our discussion, from something you said earlier to a similar rabbinic statement, but in a different angle. The temple was destroyed, you said, because of people who were not willing to go to the Lifnei Meshurat Hadin, who were following the letter of the law. So the other answer given was the temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, needless hatred between brothers and sisters in ancient Israel. And the question is, Israel kind of teeters between two extremes. One is the Haredi extreme, which tries to enforce religious monopoly over Israel, which I know you're commenting against. The other is extreme of a nation of Hebrew-speaking Goyim, where it's a secular nation without any Jewish content or Jewish identity, Jewish values. How do you see bridging the gap between the secular and the religious, where you can have a Jewish state, but it's non-coercive? It's one that's inspiring as opposed to coercing people to follow a Jewish path.
Right. We need another hour and a half for that one, but I'll try to be precise, not for a rabbi, because rabbis don't know how to be precise. I'll try to be there is a majority of Israelis, when you take out the radical secular, which is only 10%, and the ultra-Orthodox, which is 10%, who actually could build bridges with each other. The majority of Israelis aren't radical secular anymore. They're Jews, and they care about Judaism. But what we need to do in Israel is that And here I'm going to turn it on its head. And that's why I'll just say it and I won't be able to explain it enough. The reason why there is religious coercion in Israel is not because of the Orthodox. There is religious coercion in Israel because the Jewish secular majority are willing to tolerate religious coercion in order to receive the support of the ultra-Orthodox on issues of foreign policy. Israeli liberal Jews are willing to sell their birthright for the sake of foreign policy and governmental coalitions. A majority can never be coerced by a minority unless it is willing to do so. The way it has to change is through, and this is principally not through legislation, but through education. When the majority of Israelis have enough at stake in their own Judaism that they're willing to say, I want to fight for my right to marry the way I want to marry, to educate my children the way I want to educate them, to live Shabbat the way I want it to live. When they care about it enough, religious coercion will come to an end. It's not about changing the minds of the ultra-Orthodox. It's about engaging secular and liberal Israeli Jews to prioritize their religious freedom over foreign policy. And when they do so, like this, it will change. But that's just a short for a much larger thesis.
And that's some of the work that you're doing, correct?
That's my whole life's work.
So we definitely have to schedule another session for that.
Anytime.
So before we conclude, we're online here. What can we as Jews in the diaspora do to further the cause of peace in the Middle East? Well, can you give us a practical step or practical steps that we can encourage the fostering of peace in the Middle East?
Great. There are two, I believe that Jews outside of Israel have to work on two parallel tracks. The first is an internal track in Canada or in the United States, wherever they may live. And the other track is in Israel. The first track, wherever you live, you have to have a clear articulation of the Israel you want. We have to stop defining Zionism as an act of loyalty and instead understand that it is an act of aspiration. You have to become committed to have a vision of what's the Israel you want, and you have to talk about it, and you have to make space for it, and you can't allow that liberal Zionism, which cares for two-state solutions, etc., be shouted out or down by those people who say, shh, don't talk, our job is to support whatever, any attack against Israel. Israel, the Israel you want has to be alive in your shul and in your community, Eli. And it has to be clear, and it has to be exciting and inspirational. And the second thing you can do is the only way you can affect Israel is not from Canada, but it's through building partnerships with Israelis. You have to strengthen and build partnerships with those Israelis who are committed to the type of Israel that your grandchildren would want to have a relationship with. Develop those partners, because it's those partners who are going to change Israel. You have every single Jew throughout the world, through federation, through philanthropy, through political action, through visits, through personal engagement, has an ability to strengthen and build partnerships in Israel. Build conceptually the Israel that you want, and build the partners who are committed to that Israel, and then you're a player. And then welcome to the war of democracy. Are we going to win? I don't know. But at least that's the game. The game is not by trying to change something and parachute it from down. In a democracy, the sovereign is the citizen. So fight for the citizen. Develop educational Don't try to tell Israel what to do. Tell Israel what you think and develop partners who think similarly. And then we have to fight together for the marketplace. We have to fight for the masses of Israelis. Right now, the mass of Israelis suffer from PTS. Half of them PTSD and the other half PTS. They're traumatized by the fact that the Palestinians rejected our peace overtures. And instead of aspiring for peace, Israelis are content with peace and quiet. Okay, I understand you. Now, how do we change that? Changing that is going to be the fundamental challenge over the next 10, 20 years, or actually till 2036. We have to succeed by 2036, Eli.
No self-interest there.
No self-interest involved.
This has been a fantastic discussion, and I want to ask you if you would just indulge us by concluding with, it's a difficult topic. There's a lot of things that make us despair and hopeless. Can you conclude by giving us one story of hope, or one or two stories of hope from this entire issue?
It's not a story. It's where I get my hope from. So first of all, my hope comes from the fact that to be a Jew is to believe that pessimism is a luxury that we can't afford. So I just don't do pessimism. I'm just not interested in it. I never succumb to it. I get up every single morning and I look at and say, what do I have to change? That's the way I live my life. And I don't care whether reality looks bleak or not. It's just irrelevant to me. Like, just nothing gets me down. Like this, here, our job is to do what we have to do. You want a good story? Well, our parents and grandparents had to survive Nazi Germany. We have to survive excess power. Really? You tell me which gives you greater hope. And our parents and grandparents got out of Auschwitz and they had kids. Could you imagine an act more insane than that in the universe? After Auschwitz, to have children, after Auschwitz, you're supposed to either commit suicide or give up on life and on humanity. And they had kids. And we are here because they had kids. They are the greatest heroes that the Jewish people ever produced. They dwarf any military hero that Israeli army produced. Dwarf. The simple act of a Holocaust survivor is the greatest act of heroism in Jewish history, greater than the Maccabees, greater than any elite unit of the army. And so why am I optimistic? Because that's my story. And our job is to be worthy, even in a small measure, not to give up hope when they didn't give up hope. But there's another reason why I have hope. And I know it's silly and it's strange. I'm a little strange sometimes. The situation between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs got so bad that everybody realizes we have to make it better. We're not going to start the path of peace in the Middle East only by working with Palestinians in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. When Israelis build bridges of understanding and cooperation with their fellow Israeli Arabs, then there'll be greater energy and hope and openness to peace with Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And so right now there is for the first time, Israel since 2003 or so has been in a status quo, and we use our power to enforce that status quo. And we have great power. Whatever you're throwing at us, we have an answer. Our military might enables us to achieve peace and quiet. But between Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs, our power is not enough. And if people realize something is broken, and if we marshal sufficient educational and social programs to create a re-engagement between Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians, that could be a catalyst for beginning to rethink our relationships. Not peace with Abu Dhabi, but peace and respect between Israeli Jews and Israeli Palestinians. And I want to tell you, for the first time, things got bad enough that there's enough people who know that we have to do things differently. And I'm working on that. And from that, I believe we can go forward. That's my hope. It's going to take time, Ellie. And there's no short solutions. Right now, our two societies are very alienated from each other, frightened from each other, and they hate each other. They really do. Palestinians in Gaza and Judea and Samaria all have PTSD from Israelis. And Israelis have PTS from them. When people are suffering that type of trauma, they don't engage in peace. But if we heal on another level, then we could begin, then that healing, I hope, can be infectious. And so that's, while, I know I'm strange, but that actually makes me very excited, because right now I have what to do when I get up tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning, I don't have what to do to make the life of a Palestinian in Gaza or Hebron better. But tomorrow morning, I can get up and work for greater respect and dignity for Jews and Arabs in Lod and Haifa and Jerusalem. And way leads to way. And I believe that goodness, just like evil, spreads. And now I have something positive to work on. And my hope is that positive vision, or that positive work, will spread. And who knows, when you plant those seeds, where it will go.
You remind me of that quote, since we talked about the destruction of the temple, the rabbis say that when the temple was destroyed, the Messiah was born. So even in the seeds of hope are being planted. So that really, really resonates with what you just said. So I want to conclude by giving you a quote from Malcolm Forbes, who one time said, "Education's purpose is to replace an empty mind with an open, one." I would suggest that education's purpose is also to replace a closed or fixed mind with an open one. And Rabbi, I have no doubt, with your intelligent, erudite, reasoned, and passionate approach that you've shared with us this morning, you have opened a lot of minds and given us a fresh perspective towards what is probably one of the world's most complicated conflicts. We wish you many years of hatzlacha and success and progress in your very important work. So thank you. And since the subject of today's discussion was peace, we're going to close with a song called "Lay Down Your Arms," a peace song, which is based on the words in Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4. "You shall beat your swords into plowshares and your spears into pruning hooks." This song was performed by members of the Habanim Choir and March of Living Choirs in 2015, and the choirs were conducted by our own Aviva Reisky, our cantor, and Tom Bellman, our guitarist, musical staff at Habanim. It was recorded at our old synagogue, Habanim, in 2015, on the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, and also includes clips from the choir singing the song in Habanim and also on the March of Living in Poland and Israel. I should add that the actual Dead Sea Scrolls are featured in the video you're about to see. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the words from Isaiah that should beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. You'll see a clip of about 5 seconds from the Israel Museum. And I may be wrong, but this may be the oldest example of human writing to appear anywhere on YouTube, with that little clip from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from the verses from Isaiah written some 2,500 years ago. Should beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks. Nations should no longer raise up arms against nation, neither should learn war anymore. So we're going to listen to this beautiful song, "Lay Down Your Arms," conducted by Aviva Reisky and Tom Bellman, sung by the Habanim and the March of Living Choirs, before we conclude our program. Thank you again. Over to Theodora.
Dear God, please hear us, listen to our prayer, and help us do thy will upon this earth. Let the children suffer war no more, and let a peaceful world be given birth. Every hand that holds a sword can hold a baby. Every heart
Thank you to Rabbi Hartman once again. Thank you to our audience and to our participating synagogues. Wish you a safe and enjoyable summer. Lech Shalom. Go in peace. Thank you all.
Thank you. Laila Tov.
All the best.